Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always had a voice for radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game. And you're listening to PTCG Radio. Now, I've been away for a week, I can only apologise. I didn't go to Worlds, as I would have possibly liked to, but I did go and spend a lovely 2 weeks in Portugal and Spain, so I can't really complain. I will, however, be at Worlds next year, and I hope to see some of you there. The good news for you is I had a lot of friends out at Worlds, and I've been combing every forum, site, Facebook page, etc. that I possibly can, and I believe I've got together the best collection of Worlds-related news, including stuff which I couldn't actually find anywhere and had to create from various different sources. So I hope you will join me as we look back at Worlds 2013. Just a quick note before we go on, and I've addressed this on the podcast before, but a couple of people have said in the past that essentially what I'm doing is just taking stuff from other sources, but you'll see as we go through this particular podcast that I've had to collate things from many different sources, and all you have to do is sit back and listen for the next 30-40 minutes and just let the knowledge wash over you. So starting off this year with the World's news, I suppose we've got to start with what is usually pretty much the first piece of World's news we get, and that is the World's promo. Now, the World's promo for this year is not a tropical promo for a change, it's called Champions Festival. Now, I'll tell you where Worlds is next year in a minute, but given that this wasn't a particularly tropical location, and neither is next year, I think they've moved away from going tropical something. This year's promo is Champions Festival, and if I had to bet money, I would bet that next year's promo would be Champions something as well. I think they've gone away from slightly tropical locations, and I think that means they've gone away from tropical promo cards. And it reads thusly. Once during each player's turn, if that player has 6 Pokémon in play, he or she may heal 10 damage from each of his or her Pokémon. Now, of course, you should guess straight away that as either player can use it anytime during their turn, it is a stadium card. Now, Tropical Beach initially people were like, looks cool, and then it became a huge staple in many, many decks. This is not that kind of thing. Now, it would have been very useful in the Truth, ironically, but that's now all rotated out, etc. Having said that, you need a Tropical Beach to set up the Truth, and playing one stadium to set up and another stadium when you got going seems like it may have been clumsy to me. Now, in any particular deck where you're already going to be filling your bench, I would say that this is a very good inclusion. But a lot of those decks, things like, for instance, Gothitelle and Ray Eels, and maybe even Klinklang, although a lot of the time you wouldn't play with a full bench with Klinklang, they're gone. And to be honest, not only that, but nowadays we've got 2 cards specifically which punish you for holding a big bench. Them being Colrus, where when either person plays a Colrus, they shuffle a hand into the deck and draw a number of cards equal to the total number of bench Pokémon. I.e., the more bench Pokémon you have, the bigger a Colrus your opponent is going to get. Similarly, we have Absol, who effectively does 20 damage times the number of Pokémon you have in play. If you have 6 Pokémon in play, you are going to be giving your opponent a 120 damage Absol for 2 energy, and that's before he uses Dark Claw or laser or anything of that nature. So Champions Festival, it's kind of cool. I don't see it seeing a huge amount of play. The other piece of news we got quite early was the competitor's bag. And as I gave you a quick rundown last year, I'll give you a quick rundown this year. There was the usual Pikachu plushie, which this time he had kind of feather hat on kind of thing. You also had the obligatory t-shirt and cap. We had the playmat like we've had every year, and a deck box like what came in last year. One thing that was new this year was the dice bag. Now you actually get a dice bag and a deck box and a mat in your Worlds bag, which makes perfect sense. Pokemon spends a huge amount of money on Worlds. I have heard rumours as to the cost. It's in the millions. And it would only make sense that, if they've put up all these banners, etc., they want to see everybody with their Worlds mat, their Worlds deck box, and their World dice bag sitting there playing, so everywhere you see, it's Worlds. The slightly disappointing thing for me this year was the pin badges gone. I like to get little pin badges from places I've been, and although I haven't been, I'd already hit someone up to sell me their Worlds pin badge. There was no pin badge this year. I hear there was a sew-on patch, or an iron-on patch of that nature. So, Moving on from there then, let's talk about the actual tournament. But of course we can't talk about the actual tournament, we have to talk about the grinder first. Now I don't know the exact number of people, there was apparently 1,000 over all the age groups, and there was certainly somewhere in the region of 500-600 for Masters. Certainly larger than the one in which I competed in Hawaii last year. But it doesn't really matter how many people were in it, what's important is it was a 6-round tournament. You had to get through 6 rounds, and if you got through 6 rounds, then you got yourself into Worlds. Nice and simple. Heartbreak for Russell Moore, who was the best placed UK player. Huge congratulations to him, who lost in the last round to Rob Wiedemann. Commiserations to Russell Moore. Huge achievement getting to 5-0, but immense disappointment losing in the last round of the grinder. Grinder again was absolutely brutal. We saw esteemed players like Yassine Sakoum and Jack Stewart Armstead from the UK, both of whom made, I believe, top 32 at Worlds last year, both of whom lost in the first round of the grinder, so I'm told, this year. And again, there were many very good players from many nationalities losing very early. It's a brutal tournament. Now I've gone through, I couldn't find a list anywhere of the grinders with their decks. What I have done is found a list of the 8 grinders, and I have found a list of decks that was compiled by a lovely man. Now, these are decks that were played in Worlds themselves. Generally, and I saw this with everyone last year, when you grind in, it tends to be you play the deck with which you grinded in. Now, I know that the Japanese player, not Komatsuda, the other one, Yamato, there we go. I know that Yamato was actually planning on playing a different deck if he grinded in, although he got knocked out in the last round last year. So what I'm going to give you here is the 8 grinders. 7 of them I can tell you what they played in the actual tournament, and I'm afraid for the time being, unless someone can give me better information, we're just going to have to assume that that's what they played in the grinder. So grinding in alphabetical order. We had Amelia Bottomire with Darkrai from the US, Dylan Drive from the US with Darkrai, Jason Klaczynski from the US with Darkrai, Michael San Roman, who I believe is from the US, but unfortunately I don't have the deck that he played, so I can only apologise there. I don't know what deck he played. Takeshi Tosa from Japan playing Darkrai, Rob Wiedemann from the US playing Rails. I hope he grinded in with Rails, I really do. Takashi Yaneda from Japan playing Darkrai, and Takuya Yaneda, also from Japan playing Darkrai Garbodor. Now I cannot guarantee that the two Yanedas are related, but I would be very surprised if they weren't. Now last year, the grinders we saw were from the US and Japan, but we also had 2 UK players grinding in. This year, all of the grinders were from Japan or from the US. And that's something we tend to see time and again in the grinder. It is very much dominated at the higher end by Japan and US. Now, it shouldn't surprise you so much, and the reason is there are far more US players than any other nationality in the grinder due to the location of Worlds. And I know it was technically in Canada, but it was just over the border, and I know there were more Americans there. And Japan has a harsh way to get into Worlds. They've got their battle carnivals, and you have to win one. You have to finish first. And I think there's something like 3 or 4 of them. You have to finish first to get your way into Worlds. It's absolutely brutal. So very few Japanese players go along with invites, so that means that the Japanese players have to rely on the grinder, which means that the kind of skill level of some of the Japanese players in the grinder is higher, quite frankly, because a lot of the really, really good American, English, etc. players are already in Worlds, and there are Japanese players that, were they in a more forgiving environment, they would have qualified. So that's a thing there. 5 Americans, 3 Japanese, and a lady going through the grinder, which shouldn't be a big deal, but unfortunately is. We need to get more ladies playing this game. So, just to finish off the news a little bit, because I forgot to fill you in on Worlds next year, it's going to be in Washington, D.C., which isn't the funnest city in the world from what I hear, but it's got a load of cool monuments, loads of museums, and it's on the east coast of the USA, which means that you're close to places like New York, so I'm sure you'll all find a lot of stuff to do over there. Unless something goes really wrong, I shall be at Worlds next year. I already tweeted this out before, but anyone who's going to Worlds next year, let me know. I would love to meet up with all of you listeners when I go to Worlds next year. And I do say when, not if. Now, the other piece of news from Pokemon this year was that it was streamed, and the finals, and some of the games were streamed by Pokemon themselves. They streamed one top 16 and top 8 game on Saturday evening, and then on Sunday they streamed the finals of all 3 age divisions, which was absolutely fantastic. Not only did they stream them, but they got people who knew what they were talking about. Now, fairly or unfairly, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to say quite fairly, the commentators were only really commentating on the Masters final last year, and they did a fairly poor job. They called Junkarm Trash Claw, they said you could use any nationality of cards in your deck, which isn't true, they referred to N as Professor N, etc. This year, they had a gentleman from Pokemon himself, who was helping out with the broadcast, I believe, but they also had someone from the community, and they were flicking between Jose Grimzarhano from the Top Cut and Josh Wittenkeller, or J-Wits from YouTube, quite frankly. And they were flicking, except when it got to the Masters final, when it was just Crims and J-Wits doing the commentary. And they did an excellent job. It was slightly more geared towards the everyman than the stuff you're used to them doing, but it had to be. But huge props to Pokemon for hiring people who do this, who comment on YouTube videos of people playing, who do this kind of stuff for free in their own time anyway, for hiring them, and I don't know if they were paid or not, but regardless, Pokemon hired them to do this work, to commentate on these games, and they did a fantastic job. Now, I'm not going to go through the juniors and seniors a lot, but I am going to tell you that in juniors, Yugo Sato from Japan, his Plasma list lost to Andre Kujal's Darkrai list in juniors, and in seniors, we saw Kaiwan Kabebe from Australia beating Clément Lamberton from France, and that was Plasma beating Rails. Now, that was a fascinating game, or fascinating match, I should say. In the first game, Kaiwan managed to set up very quickly a blizzard-burning Kyurem, along with a Caldea with a float stone, so that he could Blizzard Burn, rush in, retreat, Blizzard Burn, along with a couple Deoxys and lasers, and knocked out 370 HP EX in 3 turns. In the second game, Clément got set up very quickly and destroyed Darkrai with loads of Rayquaza attacks. But then in the third game, Kaiwan's start was just too darn fast. So that was juniors and seniors. Masters we're going to go through in a little more detail, because this always has more of an impact on us. Now, firstly, I want to give props to the UK players who made top 32. We were quite well represented in top 32 this year. We had Charlie Powell, Tamal Cameron, and Sami Sakum all finishing 6-2 and getting into cut. And we had Jake Walvin, he who, shall we say, made a boo-boo in top 4 at UK Nats, but also managed to get into top 16 at the ECC, managed to go 7-1, and managed to cut Worlds, I believe, in 7th place. So huge congratulations to them. The unfortunate thing was that all 4 of them lost out in top 32. Disappointing, but huge props to those 4 UK players for making top cut. Now, there were some quite big names who didn't make cut. Looking at players who did well last year, last year's winner, Igor Costa, went 2-6. Last year's runner-up, Harrison Levin, went 2-5 and dropped before the last round. Last year's third-place finisher, Jay Hornung, finished 4-4. And Edmund Kuras, the US national champion, also finished 4-4. In slightly better news, Chase Maloney, who won Worlds in Seniors last year, managed to make it into top 16 with his Darkrai deck, showing that he can cut it in Masters as well as in Seniors. So, looking at the top 32 decks, it was quite frankly quite surprising in some ways. One of the most surprising things, there was no Gothitelle whatsoever in the top cut of Worlds this year. Not a single Gothitelle made top cut. And the reason for that, quite frankly, Plasma lists can outspeed them. Blastoise lists, and I'll tell you more about this in a moment, but Blastoise lists were made with a focus to beat them. Darkrai was popular and made with a focus to beat them, and it wasn't actually all that played. Looking down at the list of decks, now I've only seen about 160 of the 208 decks, but there were not many Gothitelle played at all. I think players were scared because it did so gosh darn well at US Nationals that people were going to be gunning for it. Even if there were more Gothitelle at Worlds, looking at the kind of decks that did well I should say, I don't believe that Gothitelle would have done very well at all. There was an 8-round tournament with 200 odd masters. I think it's about 201 in the end. Or maybe it's 208, but there were some drop-offs. Either way, it was just over 200. There were 8 rounds of a top 32. And in the top 32, we know 31 of the decks. Now, Michael San Roman, he who grinded in, managed to make it to top 32, but I have no idea what he was playing. It's not been reported yet. But looking at the decks, the most popular was Plasma, with 11 top cut spots. Second, we had Blastoise with 7 top cut spots. The third deck was actually tied between Darkrai and Klinklang. Now, there were 5 Darkrai decks in Top Cut, 2 of them playing with Garbodor, and there were 5 Klinklang decks in Top Cut. One of them, I believe, was kind of the old school because it played Darkrai and Caldeo, but there were 4 just Plasma Clang decks in Top Cut, 2 of which piloted by UK heroes Tamal Cameron and Charlie Powell. Now, a lot of people were put off of Klinklang because it had a pretty much auto loss to Gothitelle. But this just goes to show that Worlds, and I said this in my pre-Worlds podcast, Worlds never follows US Nationals. It never does. You can never, if anything, Worlds works as a reaction to US Nationals. No Gothitelle in cut, and that paves the way for 4 Plasma. Now, there's Colin Mole from a popular online blog who really popularised Klinklang this year. He made 5-3 and whiffed it on Resistance. Now, the other decks to round out the top cut, there were 2 Ray-Eels, and I love the 2 people who played Ray-Eels. There were some UK players who took Ray-Eels along. I think George Boone and Tommy Roberts both played it. Failing to make top cut, unfortunately. But there were 2 Ray-Eels decks in top cut, so a nice goodbye to Ray-Eels there. Dylan Bryan played an incredibly rogue deck I'll tell you more about in a minute. And then there was whatever Michael San Roman played. So not the most diverse top cut ever. There were 4 decks that represented in big numbers, 2 Ray-Eels, and a very, very rogue deck. So, let's take you through some of the... Also, just to tell you a little bit more about Top Cut, all the 6-2s cut, only 2 5-3s cut. So 5-3 you had to get incredibly lucky to cut. Now, before we go into the Top Cut in more detail, I want to tell you about some interesting decks that I saw being played in the Swiss rounds, and I'll tell you a little bit about them, and I'll tell you where they finished. So, one of the things I did notice, there were only 2 players, as far as has been reported, were playing Flareon. Romain D from France and Javier Favilli from Argentina. At this point, I'm going to give you my usual apology for any names I mispronounce. Now, they both played Flareon, and they actually did a lot better than some people would think. Romain D from France made it all the way to 4-4. And Javier Favilli from Argentina made it all the way to 5-3, missing cut on Resistance, because as I said, only 2 5-3s cut. But that's pretty gosh darn good. Ross Cawthorn carried on his reputation of playing unfamiliar things by playing a Celebi Gothitelle deck. So, playing Gothitelle with the item lock, but Celebi EX has a body which allows you to use attacks from pre-evolutions. And there is, I believe, a Gothorita which has an attack that allows you to flip a coin and if heads, discard an energy attached to the defending Pokémon. So, clearly this is an energy denial deck. And again, I haven't been told this is what I've deduced, I could be wrong, but this seems to be what he's playing. So I assume this will be played with Enhanced Hammer and Crushing Hammer. You set up the item lock so they can't use items, i.e. no Dark Patch, no Colress Machine. They're attaching 1 energy per turn. And then you've got Crushing Hammer because it's a unilateral item lock, doesn't work for you as well. And then you use the Gothitelle attack, which does a little bit of damage and takes off their energy, and they die very, very slowly, but of course it doesn't matter how slowly they die, because you're getting rid of all their energy. There may well have been lasers in there as well, which would have taken down their energy, their HP, as they couldn't attack or retreat, but due to having no energy. So, congrats to Ross Cawthorn for again coming out of a good deck. Ross Cawthorn annoys me a little bit, purely because he's called Ross and he's very good at the game, and I've on more than one occasion had people on the internet thinking that we were the same person. I wish I had that level of success. Next year I will, and then people will be thinking he's me. There were 2 players who played Plasma with Umbreon, both Harrison Levin and Michael Canaves. But unfortunately, Harrison Levin finished 2-5 drop, and Michael went 0-3 drop. As much as I love Umbreon, it appears that it wasn't the best idea to put it into a Plasma deck. Now, there were a couple Singapore players who played Taraki and Cobalion, and I haven't looked where they finished, but they didn't make cut. There was very, very little Gothitelle in Swiss, but there was a lot of Blastoise, a lot of Plasma, and quite a lot of Darkrai. So, before I run you through what the actual results were from top 16 onwards, I want to tell you about a couple specific decks. Now, Dylan Bryan played a very, very interesting deck. His top 16 match against Jason Glasinski was broadcast online by Pokémon, and he was playing a deck which had pretty much everything in it. It had Garbodor to lock abilities, it had Flareon to hit for lots of damage if your discard pile was full of Pokemon. I've got a bunch of Flareon videos on my YouTube channel, and there are 2 more that have just rendered and will be uploaded after this podcast, so I encourage you to go and have a look at that to see how that Flareon can be effective. It also had Leafeon on there, who does more damage. I think there's 20 damage times the total number of energy on your opponent's field. Very good against Blastoise, especially when you're locking them with Garbodor. He had Drifblim in there, which does 50 damage times the amount of special energy in your opponent's discard pile, and Enhanced Hammer to get special energy into the discard pile. Clearly a Plasma tech. And he also had a Terrakion and a Landorus in there to try and take down Darkrai. He basically played a little bit of everything to try and make sure that there was always something he could do against whatever deck he faced. A very inventive deck. Congratulations to Dylan Bryan. Now, Jason Klasinski's Darkrai deck was quite unusual in that he didn't play Absol. Now, he basically just played, I think he played 1 Caldeo, and he played Sableye, and he played Darkrai. And he basically only ever used Junk Hunt and Night Spear. He did quite well, so yeah, good luck, good to him, quite frankly. A lot of people thinking Absol was good. Jason chose not to go with Absol. I don't know whether his deck was better because of it, but let's face it, he's a better player than me, with a longer list of accomplishments, so I'm willing to believe it was a better way to go. One thing I will remind you of is that there is that tool coming out, which allows you to do more damage to Pokemon EXs. EXs are going to be hunted next format, it looks like, so Absol, I think, is still going to be incredibly useful. Simon the Road, who did very well with Plasma, I'll tell you how well in a minute, he actually played a Lugia and a DCE in his list. Not Scramble Switch, I should add, he still played Computer Search. Very interesting, as coming off of Nationals, a lot of people were really focusing on Plasma with Kyurem and maybe Absol to really focus on the non-EX quick hitters, rather than the big 2 prize getting Lugia, or 3 prize if you knock out an EX. So, yeah. Different kind of lists that seem to do pretty gosh darn well. And finally, the other deck I want to talk about quickly is the Blastoise deck. Now, Gino Lombardi, who did very, very well at Worlds, and James Good seem to be, and I can't guarantee this, but they seem to be playing very, very similar lists. And Gino was good enough to put his deck up online, so we got a quick look at it. And quite frankly, it's an unusual deck. He's playing it with 2 Wartortle, clearly there to try and make sure that he can set up it with Gothitelle. Playing it with Silent, the support that allows you to grab free energy from your deck. Again, very, very good against something like Gothitelle. And it was played with 4 Caldeo and only 2 Black Kyurem. So clearly, you can, and then it was played, yeah, so looking at that, you can see that it's very much played with Gothitelle in mind. 4 Caldeo means you're likely to have a couple Caldeo out. Playing the Silent makes it, and he played 2 of them, made it more likely that you're going to be able to get the energy out that you need. And also played with a Heavy Ball and a Level Ball, so that they can be Skylared for, so you don't just have to use Ultra Ball all the time. 3 Tropical Beach. Very, very good indeed, quite frankly. I can see that beating Gothitelle. And again, pure consistency. Lots of supporters, 4 Rare Candy, 3 Tropical Beach. Only 2 Black Kyurem, but it's a kind of deck which is going to possibly set up faster in the mirror. It's a kind of deck which is going to beat Gothitelle even under item lock because of the 2 Wartortles and the 2 Silents. and it's already got a good Darkrai matchup before you start. No Tool Scrapper, so it makes it very, very difficult to beat Garbodor, and no Fire Tech, which again I've been saying for a long time you shouldn't play anyway because it makes the deck too inconsistent. Having said that, Charlie Powell from the UK playing Kling Klang did lose to James Good's Blastoise in top 32, so maybe didn't need to Fire Tech. Although I would like to point out that one of those games he didn't set up and then he lost in sudden death. So, I've told you about the counts of different decks in top 32, I've told you about the weirder decks, and I've told you about kind of how the decks were being made. So what I want to do now is I just want to take you through nice and quickly the top 16 onwards, just so you can see how the bracket actually went as it went through Worlds. So, going into top 16, we had Takuya Yaneda. He was the number 1 seed at 8-0 and grinded in. So he grinded in and then went undefeated in Swiss. And in top 16, he beat Gunther Kirchhofer, and again, my apologies for pronunciation, Plasma deck. Also in top 16, we had a mirror match between Gino Lombardi and James Good, both from the US, both playing Blastoise, and James Good came out on top of that. We had Chase Maloney from Canada, last year's seniors national champion, his Darkrai losing to Simon the Rhodes Plasma, and that's the one I said that had Lugia in. We had Johnny Rabus from the US Plasma deck, beating Joey Ho from Singapore's Kling Klang Caldeo Darkrai, which I imagine would be more like the old Shift Gear with just a Tech Plasma. We had Jonathan Bristow from the US's Ray Eels, beating Mike Newman from the US's Blastoise. We had the streamed game where Jason Klaczynski's Darkrai beat Dylan Bryan's Everything deck. We had Kerwin Lee from Australia and his Ray Eels deck losing to Dustin Zimmerman's Darkrai Garbodor. And Rick Valois from the Netherlands, his Plasma deck, beat Jose Palomino from Mexico's Plasma deck. But this was a Plasma with Kyurem and Deoxys and Experience Share, the one I told you about previously. Moving into top 8, Takuya Yaneda's amazing run all the way from grinder to undefeated failed, unfortunately, in top 8 in the streamed game against James Good's Blastoise. Now, bearing in mind James Good's Blastoise didn't play any Tool Scrapper, James Good did amazingly. And I've heard from people, James Good, a new player this year, first year, and I've heard from people who met him at Worlds and said he was a lovely chap. So congratulations to him, getting all the way to top 4. Simon the Rhodes Plasma beat Johnny Rabus's Plasma, Lugia. So they both played Lugia in that game. Jonathan Bristow's Ray Eels unfortunately lost out to Jason Klaczynski's Darkrai, and Dustin Zimmerman and his Darkrai deck, Darkrai Garbodor, beat Rick Valois' Plasma. Now moving into the top 4, we had Jason Good's Blastoise losing to Simon the Rhodes Plasma, and Jason Klaczynski's Darkrai beating Dustin Zimmerman's Darkrai Garbodor. And that led to a very exciting finals, where Jason Klaczynski became the first third-time world champion, beating Dustin Zimmerman's Darkrai Garbodor. What is also a first was that Jason Klaczynski grinded in. Now, just take a second, try and think of who is the most successful grinder of all time. It's actually a tie between two brothers. Last year, Mike Diaz grinded all the way to top 4, I believe 3rd place, and in 2010 his brother Frank Diaz grinded all the way to top 4 and 3rd place. But Jason Klaczynski had them both beaten, going all the way to the final and winning his 3rd World Championship. Interesting that a Darkrai deck that played no Absol made it all the way there. He did play Bicycle for speed, he did play Enhanced Hammer for Plasma, and quite frankly, again, you can't read a huge amount into this because Jason Klaczynski is, for the vast majority of people, a cut above. But clearly, he made a deck which didn't need Absol and was perfectly good without it. There was some controversy in Jason Klaczynski's top 8 game against Dylan Bryan. His top 16 game against Dylan Bryan, where he attached 2 energies in one turn and got given a game loss, but given that he'd grinded all the way in and then played 8 rounds and top 32 in the same day and was currently in his top 16, and he was on the stage in front of a huge crowd of people, I think we can probably forgive him for making a small mistake. So congratulations to Jason Klaczynski for that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty much how Worlds went this year. I've told you about all the decks. that are represented in Top 32. I've told you about the unusual decks and the unusual build of decks, and I've told you about some players you might want to have heard about. I'm just going to finish off talking quickly about the grinder again, because one thing I noticed last year was Aaron Curry grinded in and got into Top Cut. Stefan Tobacco grinded in and made it all the way to Top 8. And I believe you seen Takum grinded in and made it to Top 32. There were a lot of grinders doing very, very well last year. So what I did was I went and had a look back, and again, this is something that I haven't seen anyone else do, so unless someone else bothers to do it, you'll only hear this on the podcast. I've gone and looked at how all the grinders actually did. So, going from worst place to best place, Amelia Bottomire and her Darkrai finished 2-4 drop. Rob Wiedemann's Rails and Takashi Yoneda's Darkrai both finished 4-4. Dylan Dreyer's Darkrai finished 5-3. Huge commiserations to Takashi Tosa's Darkrai, who finished 5-3, and although many 5-3s missed cut, he came 36th, just 4 places below Top Cut, so my commiserations to him. And then moving into Top Cut, we had again nothing better than last year, we had 3 grinders who made it into Top Cut. We had Michael San Roman, still don't know what he's playing, but he made it to Top 32. Takuya Yoneda went undefeated in Swiss and made it all the way to Top 8. And as I've just told you, Jason Klaczynski's Darkrai made it all the way to the final and won, becoming the first person to ever do that. So congratulations to all of those people, to anyone that competed at Worlds. I was very sad not to be at Worlds this year and to not be competing in the grinder, but I had a great time on my holiday. I enjoyed following online. It was much easier to follow online than usual. So, quite frankly, it was a good weekend all round. Next year it's in Washington, D.C., and quite frankly, I intend to be there. Hopefully going with an invite, not having to go through the grinder again. I was away for a week. I hope you didn't miss me too much, but the good news is I shouldn't be away for another week for quite some time, and there's going to be YouTube videos coming thick and fast. There's a couple PTCGO videos coming shortly, by that I mean today, after this podcast goes up, and there's 2 new types of videos, not actually battle videos, which I am working on, which you'll hopefully see in the next couple of weeks, because that's going to take me some work to do them. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can in the usual ways. You can tweet me at TheWassy. You can email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk. Or if you're listening to this on SoundCloud or on YouTube or on WordPress, just stick a comment down where you're listening to this. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, I'll be back taking a good look at Plasma Blast, because I haven't done that yet. Thank you very much for listening. My name's Ross, and you've been listening to PTCG Radio.